July 12, 2021, began like any other summer day in eastern Tennessee, but by the time the sun dropped behind the ridgelines of Great Smoky Mountains National Park, something had already gone wrong in a way no one could immediately understand. Emily Carter had planned the trip carefully. At 31, she had learned to measure her time in small, controlled decisions. Working part-time as a nurse while raising her 7-month-old son alone had reshaped her life into something structured and disciplined. That Saturday was supposed to be different. It was meant to be a quiet break, a single day where she could step outside the routines that had been pressing in on her for months. She chose a well-known trail near the main entrance, accessible, familiar, and considered safe by park standards. Her mother, Linda Carter, had agreed to pick them up in the early evening. The plan was simple. Emily would spend the day walking the short boardwalk trails, rest when needed, and return before dark. Linda would arrive at 6:30 p.m., and they would head back to Knoxville together. It was a routine arrangement, the kind built on reliability rather than uncertainty. At 6:30, Linda arrived exactly as planned. Emily's car was there. The parking lot, which had been crowded earlier in the day, had thinned out. Families had already left. Tour buses were gone. A few vehicles remained scattered across the asphalt, but none of them mattered to Linda. She focused only on the one car she recognized immediately. Emily's phone went unanswered. The first call felt like a minor delay. The second introduced doubt. By the sixth, something had shifted into something colder and more difficult to explain. Emily was not someone who lost track of time. She was not someone who ignored calls, especially not with a baby. Her routines were precise, her habits predictable. That consistency was what made the silence feel wrong. By 7:45 p.m., the situation moved beyond personal concern. Linda stepped into the ranger station and reported them missing. The first response followed standard procedure. Park rangers checked the immediate trails near the entrance. Vehicles were logged. Names were recorded. Descriptions were taken. Emily Carter, 31 years old. Noah Carter, 7 months. Clothing descriptions. Last known time. Intended route. No deviations from a typical day. Nothing in the report suggested risk-taking behavior or an attempt to leave unnoticed. By 9:30 p.m., local law enforcement was involved. The missing persons report became official. The search began that night. Initial assumptions leaned toward disorientation. Even experienced visitors could lose their bearings in unfamiliar terrain, especially as daylight faded. The park covered vast areas, and while Emily had intended to stay within the safer, marked paths, uncertainty always existed once someone moved beyond a known point. Teams started with the most logical areas, paths close to the entrance, rest areas, and the connecting loops most commonly used by visitors. No trace appeared. By early morning on July 13th, the operation expanded. Additional personnel arrived. Search grids were mapped out with precision. Volunteers joined alongside trained teams. The situation escalated quickly because of one critical detail: the presence of an infant. Time became a factor that could not be ignored. Every hour carried weight. Emily's background was reviewed in parallel with the physical search. Detectives looked for reasons that might explain a voluntary disappearance. There were none. Her financial records showed strain but not instability. Her employment history was consistent. No evidence suggested she was planning to leave. There were no unusual communications, no recent conflicts, no sudden withdrawals of money. Everything pointed toward a normal life under pressure, not one about to break apart. The absence of explanation became the central problem. On the second day, a complication emerged that shifted the direction of the search. A section of the forest west of the main trails was suddenly restricted due to what was described as a safety concern. The details were limited, but the decision was immediate and enforced without exception. Search teams were instructed to redirect their efforts away from that zone and focus on other areas that extended deeper into the park. The decision created tension within the operation. That restricted section was not random. It bordered areas that Emily could have reached if she had strayed slightly from her planned route. Still, protocol overrode instinct. The search adapted. Days passed. The scale of the operation increased, but the results remained unchanged. No belongings. No signs of disturbance. No physical evidence tying Emily or Noah to any specific location beyond the parking area. It was not just that they were missing. It was that they had disappeared without leaving anything behind. By the end of the second week, exhaustion had begun to affect the operation. Resources were reassigned. The intensity of the search reduced. The official language shifted subtly, moving from urgency to probability. The working theory leaned toward an accident somewhere beyond the accessible zones, an outcome that could not be verified but was considered the most likely explanation given the lack of evidence. Linda Carter refused to accept it. To her, the absence of evidence was not confirmation of loss. It was proof that something had been overlooked. She continued pushing for further searches, especially in the restricted area that had never been fully examined. Her requests were noted but not acted upon. The case began its transition into silence. What remained was a car in a parking lot, a timeline that ended too early in the day, and a question that no one could answer. How could two people vanish from one of the most visited areas of a national park without leaving a single trace behind? The search did not slow down after that first night. If anything, it became more structured, more systematic, and more urgent as the reality of the situation settled in across multiple agencies. By the morning of July 13th, the disappearance of Emily Carter and her infant son Noah had already moved beyond a routine missing persons case. It was now classified as a high-priority search, driven by the vulnerability of a child and the complete absence of any trace. Command was formally established near the park entrance. Law enforcement from Sevier County coordinated with National Park Service Rangers and Tennessee Emergency Management personnel. Maps were laid out, grids assigned, and teams deployed with a level of precision that reflected both experience and concern. The assumption guiding those early hours was simple. Emily had remained close to where she intended to go. Everything about her background supported that conclusion. She had chosen a short, accessible trail. She had packed for a day trip, not an overnight stay. She had arranged a fixed pickup time. There was no reason to believe she would have moved far from that initial plan. Search teams focused heavily on the main boardwalk routes and the connecting loops that branched from them. These areas were among the most trafficked in the park, especially during peak summer weekends. Rangers noted that dozens, sometimes hundreds, of visitors passed through those same paths daily. If something had happened in plain sight, someone should have seen it. That expectation quickly turned into a problem. No witnesses came forward. No reports of distress. No unusual observations. It was as if Emily and Noah had stepped into a gap that no one else had noticed. K-9 units were brought in before noon. Handlers worked from the parking lot outward, attempting to pick up Emily's scent from her vehicle. The results were inconclusive. The heavy foot traffic from earlier in the day had contaminated the area. Too many overlapping trails, too many competing signals. The dogs struggled to isolate a clear direction, and without that, the teams were forced to rely entirely on probability rather than evidence. At the same time, investigators began building a timeline using digital records. Emily's phone had last connected to a cell tower near the park entrance shortly after 10 a.m., consistent with the time her mother had dropped her off. After that, there were no further pings, no outgoing calls, no data usage. The phone had either lost signal quickly or stopped functioning altogether early in the day. That detail reinforced the idea that whatever had happened, it had happened sooner rather than later. By mid-afternoon on the second day, discussions shifted toward expanding the search perimeter. If Emily had somehow left the main trails, intentionally or not, she could have moved into less accessible areas without realizing it. Those zones were more complex, with unmarked paths, service roads, and sections rarely visited by casual hikers. The plan was to begin extending the grid westward, covering terrain that bordered the edges of the maintained trail system. That plan changed abruptly. Shortly before teams were scheduled to move into the expanded search area, a directive came down restricting access to a significant section of forest west of the primary trails. The explanation was framed as a safety precaution tied to an environmental concern. Details were limited, But the order was clear and immediate. Ground teams were not permitted to enter the affected zone. K-9 units were pulled back. The area was marked off as temporarily off-limits until further assessment could be completed. The decision created immediate friction among the personnel on site. Experienced rangers questioned the timing. The restricted zone overlapped directly with the area they had identified as the most logical extension of Emily's possible route. It was not an arbitrary section of land. It was precisely where the search needed to go next. Despite the objections protocol held, safety regulations were cited. Liability concerns were emphasized. The command structure reinforced the restriction, and the operation adapted once again. Resources were redirected deeper into the park, focusing on areas that required more specialized equipment and longer deployment times. Air support was increased. Helicopters conducted grid searches from above, though visibility into dense forested sections remained limited. The shift in focus came with consequences. The deeper areas of the park presented far greater challenges. Terrain became less predictable. Movement slowed. Communication grew more complicated. The likelihood of finding clear evidence decreased with every mile away from the original point of disappearance. Still, the teams continued, driven by the same urgency that had defined the first hours of the search. By the third day, fatigue began to surface. Not in a dramatic way, but in the small adjustments that signaled strain. Rotations shortened. Volunteers cycled out. Professional teams pushed longer hours. The expectation that something would be found started to erode, replaced by a quieter uncertainty that no one openly voiced. Investigators revisited Emily's profile repeatedly, looking for anything that might have been overlooked. Every detail was rechecked. Her work schedule, her financial situation, her relationships, her medical history. The conclusion remained unchanged. There was no indication she had intended to disappear. There was no evidence pointing to an external threat. There was no explanation that fit the absence of physical evidence. That absence became the defining feature of the case. By the end of the first week, the search had covered thousands of acres without producing a single confirmed lead. Not a piece of clothing. Not a personal item. Not even a partial indication of direction. The scale of the operation had been massive, but the result was still the same as it had been on the first night. Nothing. The second week brought a shift in tone. The official language used in briefings began to change, becoming more cautious, more measured. The urgency was still present, but it was tempered by the reality that the most critical window had passed. Statistically, the chances of a positive outcome diminished with time, especially in an environment where exposure and isolation could become fatal quickly. Linda Carter refused to adjust to that shift. She remained present at the command area, pushing for continued effort, asking the same question in different forms. Why had that specific section been closed? Why had it not been searched thoroughly before the restriction took effect? The answers she received were procedural, consistent, and unsatisfying. The area was unsafe. The decision was necessary. The search had been conducted within acceptable limits. 2 weeks after the disappearance, the operation was scaled back. Personnel were reassigned. Active search efforts were reduced. The case transitioned into a lower intensity phase, with periodic checks replacing continuous coverage. The prevailing assumption settled into place. Emily Carter and her son had likely moved beyond the accessible areas and succumbed to circumstances that could no longer be reversed. What remained unresolved was not just their disappearance, but the unanswered questions surrounding the one place no one had been allowed to fully examine. By the end of July 2021, the case had already begun to lose the intensity it once carried. What had started as a high-priority search involving multiple agencies slowly transitioned into a quieter, procedural phase. The structure remained in place on paper, but the urgency that had defined those first days was no longer present in the same way. The official records continued to reflect ongoing attention, but in practice, the operation had narrowed significantly. Search teams were no longer moving through assigned grids on a daily basis. Instead, the case relied on periodic checks, follow-up reviews, and the hope that anything would surface to justify a renewed push. It never did. The absence of evidence became the defining characteristic of the investigation. Detectives revisited Emily Carter's profile repeatedly over the following weeks, attempting to uncover any detail that might have been missed during the initial review. Each pass produced the same result. Her life, while not easy, followed a clear and understandable pattern. She worked part-time at a regional hospital, balancing long shifts with the demands of raising an infant alone. Financial pressure was visible in her records, but it was consistent with her situation, not extreme. There were no sudden withdrawals, no unusual transactions, no unexplained income. Her communication history showed regular contact with her mother and a small circle of coworkers. There were no hidden relationships, no unexplained gaps, no messages that suggested planning or intent to leave. Everything pointed to someone who was managing a difficult life, not abandoning it. That consistency made the disappearance harder to accept. In cases where individuals chose to leave voluntarily, investigators usually found traces, small inconsistencies, subtle shifts in behavior, fragments that hinted at preparation. In Emily's case, there were none. Her schedule for that weekend had been ordinary. Her plans for the following week were already set. Her responsibilities at work had not been transferred or delayed. She had packed for a day trip and nothing more. The timeline remained fixed. She had arrived at the park around 10 a.m. Her phone had connected to a nearby tower shortly after. Then the signal ended. No further data points existed beyond that moment. The lack of digital activity reinforced the idea that whatever had happened occurred early, before she could establish any meaningful distance from the entrance. That detail continued to trouble investigators. The focus returned again and again to the immediate area surrounding the parking lot and the main trails. Those locations had been searched extensively, yet they remained the only places connected to her last confirmed presence. The question that lingered beneath every report was simple. If she had stayed within that area, how had she disappeared without being seen? By early August, media attention had begun to fade. The initial coverage had been intense, driven by the involvement of a young mother and a child. Local news stations had followed every development during the first week. National outlets had briefly picked up the story. Social media had circulated her photo widely. But without new information, the cycle moved on. The case remained, but the visibility did not. For Linda Carter, the passage of time did not bring acceptance. It only sharpened the sense that something had been left unresolved. She continued contacting investigators, asking for updates, requesting clarification on decisions that had been made during the first days of the search. Her focus never shifted from one specific point: the restricted zone. That area had never been fully examined on foot. From her perspective, it represented the only remaining possibility that had not been exhausted. She questioned why a critical section of the search area had been closed at the exact moment when teams were preparing to expand into it. She asked what had changed, what information had justified the decision, and why it had not been revisited after the initial emergency period ended. The responses remained consistent. The restriction had been based on safety concerns. The decision had followed established protocols. The area had been monitored from a distance, and no signs of activity had been detected. There was no indication that revisiting it would produce different results. The explanations did not satisfy her. By September, the case was formally reclassified as an ongoing investigation with no active search operations in place. The language used in official documents shifted again, moving further away from urgency. Terms like presumed outcome and likely scenario began to appear more frequently. The working assumption settled into a version of events that could not be proven but fit the available facts. Emily Carter had likely moved beyond the accessible trails and encountered conditions she could not survive. Noah, as an infant, would not have survived independently. It was an explanation built on probability rather than evidence. Linda refused to accept it. She began organizing her own efforts, printing flyers, contacting local organizations, and reaching out to anyone who might still be willing to help. Private investigators were briefly consulted, but without new leads or access to additional resources, their involvement remained limited. The case had already been examined from every available angle within the constraints of what was known. What remained was the unknown. 3 months after the disappearance, the file contained hundreds of pages of reports, maps, and statements, yet none of them answered the central question. There was no confirmed location, no recovered item, no witness account that could place Emily and Noah anywhere beyond the parking lot. The lack of closure began to define the case as much as the disappearance itself. For investigators, it represented a situation where all standard procedures had been followed without producing a result. For Linda, it represented a failure to look in the one place that still mattered. That difference in perspective created a quiet divide, one that would persist long after the case moved out of public view. As fall approached and the park entered a less crowded season, the official activity surrounding the case diminished further. Periodic checks continued, and the file remained open, but the expectation of a breakthrough had faded. The story, for most people, had ended. But for Linda Carter, it had not changed at all. The car was still there in her memory. The timeline still stopped at the same moment, and the unanswered question remained exactly where it had been from the beginning. If Emily had never intended to go far, then the answer had to be closer than anyone was willing to admit. By early June 2022, nearly 11 months after Emily Carter and her son had disappeared, the case existed in a suspended state. Still open, still unresolved, but no longer active in the way it had once been. The official file remained accessible within the system, reviewed occasionally, updated when necessary, but without momentum. For most people, the absence of new information had already translated into a quiet assumption that the outcome was final. That assumption was interrupted without warning. The discovery was not connected to the investigation at first. It did not originate from law enforcement or from any effort tied to the case. It came from a group of recreational hunters operating within a permitted zone deep inside the national park, in an area that had not been part of the original search grid. Their activity was routine, unrelated to any ongoing inquiry, and it might have remained that way if not for one unusual detail. They encountered a large python, an invasive species that had occasionally been reported in isolated parts of the region. What drew their attention was not the presence of the animal itself, but its condition. The body appeared distended in a way that suggested recent ingestion, yet the shape was irregular, not consistent with typical prey found in that environment. The animal was secured and reported to park authorities, following standard wildlife protocols. At that stage, the situation was still considered a matter of environmental concern rather than anything related to a missing persons case. However, once the animal was examined, the situation changed immediately. Inside, investigators did not find biological remains. They found a foreign object. It was a hardened metallic camping container, deformed but intact, bearing signs of prolonged exposure. The object was large enough to explain the abnormal condition of the animal, yet clearly not something that could be digested. Its presence raised immediate questions not about the animal, but about how such an item had ended up deep within a restricted section of the park. The discovery triggered a secondary review. Park authorities contacted local law enforcement, and the item was transferred for closer examination. Initial inspection revealed no immediate identification markings, but its type was specific. It matched commercially available camping storage units often used for extended trips, durable, weather-resistant, designed to protect supplies over long periods. It was not something typically carried on short, casual outings. That detail stood out. Emily Carter had not packed for an extended stay. Her belongings, as recorded at the time of her disappearance, did not include equipment of that type. The item did not fit her profile, nor did it align with the original assumptions about her movements on the day she vanished. Despite that, the location of the discovery could not be ignored. The coordinates placed the find within a region that had not been fully searched during the initial operation. More importantly, it overlapped with the same western sector that had been restricted during the second day of the search. The connection was indirect, but it was enough to raise concern among those familiar with the case. The file was reopened for active review. Detectives revisited the original reports with renewed focus, paying particular attention to the decisions made during the early stages of the search. The restriction of that specific zone, once justified as a necessary precaution, now carried different weight. It was no longer just an operational detail. It had become a potential point of failure. The metallic container was analyzed in detail. Its exterior showed signs of wear consistent with long-term exposure, but not with violent damage. There were no clear indications of impact or forced entry. The deformation appeared gradual, likely the result of pressure over time rather than a single event. Inside, no personal items were found, only residue consistent with stored materials that had since degraded or been removed. No direct link to Emily Carter could be established. Even so, the discovery forced a shift in perspective. Up until that moment, the prevailing theory had centered on the idea that Emily and her son had moved beyond the accessible areas and encountered conditions that led to their disappearance. The lack of evidence had supported that assumption. Now there was physical proof that an object, one that did not belong to her, had been present in a zone that had never been properly examined. That inconsistency created a problem. If the area had contained overlooked items, it raised the possibility that it had also contained overlooked evidence. The decision to restrict access, once seen as a necessary precaution, now appeared as a gap in the investigation, one that could no longer be dismissed as inconsequential. The case began to regain attention. Internally, the tone shifted from passive review to active reconsideration. The absence of biological evidence in the discovery was significant. It meant that the object itself was not tied to a confirmed fatal event. It also meant that previous assumptions about the conditions within that area might have been incomplete. For Linda Carter, the development confirmed what she had been saying for nearly a year. The place that had been ignored was now the only place producing results. She was contacted shortly after the discovery was processed. The information provided to her was limited, but the implication was clear. The investigation was moving again, not because of new answers, but because of a question that had never been fully addressed. Why had that area been left unsearched? The question, once dismissed, now stood at the center of the case. The metallic container did not provide closure. It did not explain what had happened to Emily or Noah, but it changed the direction of the investigation in a way that no amount of speculation had managed to do. For the first time in months, there was a reason to look back at the beginning and consider that something critical had been missed. Not because it was hidden too well, but because it had never been examined at all. The discovery of the metallic container did not close the case. It did something more unsettling. It forced investigators to confront the possibility that the original narrative had been built on incomplete assumptions. Within days of the object being recovered, it was transferred to a regional forensic laboratory for detailed analysis. The process was methodical. Every surface was examined, every residue collected, every trace documented. The expectation was not certainty, but possibility. If the object had any connection to Emily Carter or her son, even indirect, it could reshape the entire case. The initial findings were unexpected. The exterior of the container showed long-term environmental exposure, but not the kind of degradation typically associated with violent or sudden events. The material had endured pressure over time, consistent with being lodged in a confined space or subjected to gradual force. The deformation pattern did not suggest impact, nor did it align with scenarios involving rapid movement or destruction. More importantly, the interior told a different story. Trace analysis revealed remnants of organic and synthetic material, but none of it matched human biological profiles. There were no fibers linked to clothing recorded in Emily's missing persons report. No DNA evidence tied to her or to Noah. The residue pointed instead to stored items, processed food packaging, fragments of camping supplies, degraded plastics. It was consistent with something that had been used as storage, not something that had contained or concealed a body. That conclusion removed one possibility while opening another. If the container had not been connected to a fatal event, then its presence raised a different question. Why had it been there at all, and how long had it remained in that location without being discovered? The timeline became critical. Forensic estimates suggested that the container had been in the environment for an extended period, potentially overlapping with the time frame of Emily's disappearance, but not necessarily originating from it. That ambiguity complicated the investigation. The object existed within the same geographic zone that had been excluded from the original search, but there was no direct evidence linking it to the case itself. Still, the implications could not be ignored. Investigators began re-examining the decision to restrict that specific section of the park. Internal communications from July 2021 were reviewed in detail. The directive had been issued quickly, with limited documentation supporting the urgency of the restriction. The justification, an environmental safety concern, remained vague in the records. There were no follow-up reports confirming the nature of the hazard. No additional data explaining why the area had remained off-limits during the most critical phase of the search. The absence of clarity became a focal point. In a standard operation, any restricted zone would be reassessed as conditions changed. Once the immediate risk was mitigated, access would typically be restored, at least partially, to ensure no critical areas were left unexamined. In this case, that reassessment had never occurred. The restriction had remained in place long enough to redirect the search permanently. That realization shifted the internal discussion. The working theory that Emily had moved deeper into the park and encountered fatal conditions was no longer the only plausible explanation. If a significant portion of the nearby terrain had never been searched on foot, then the assumption that all accessible areas had been covered was no longer accurate. At the same time, the lack of biological evidence in the container reinforced another possibility. Emily and Noah had not been found because they were not there. That conclusion was not stated formally, but it began to influence the direction of the investigation. Detectives expanded their review beyond the physical environment, revisiting the earliest hours of the case with a different perspective. They examined the sequence of events between Emily's arrival at the park and the moment her phone signal disappeared. They looked again at the parking lot records, the vehicles present that day, the individuals who had entered and exited within the same time frame. Nothing immediately stood out. Yet the absence of evidence no longer carried the same weight. It was no longer seen as confirmation of a single outcome, but as a gap that might have been created by limitations in the initial search. The case began to reopen in a practical sense. Requests were made to authorize a controlled search of the previously restricted zone. This time, the justification was stronger. There was documented evidence that items could remain undetected in that area for extended periods. There was also growing concern that the original decision to avoid the zone had left a critical blind spot in the investigation. Approval was granted under strict conditions. A smaller, specialized team was assembled to enter the area and conduct a detailed survey. Unlike the large-scale operation from the previous year, this effort was targeted and deliberate. Every section would be examined with a level of precision that had not been possible during the initial search. For Linda Carter, the development marked a turning point. For nearly a year, she had insisted that the answer lay in the one place no one had fully explored. Now, that belief was no longer dismissed. It had become the basis for renewed action. At the same time, the emotional impact of the new findings was complex. The absence of evidence in the container meant there was no confirmation of loss. There was no definitive proof that Emily and Noah had died in the park. That uncertainty created space for a different possibility, one that had not been seriously considered before. If they had not been found, and if the area closest to their last known location had not been fully searched, then the case was not just unresolved. It was incomplete. The investigation moved forward with that understanding. What had once been treated as a closed narrative was now open again, not because of a clear answer, but because the original question had never been fully explored. The authorization to re-enter the restricted zone marked the first decisive shift in the investigation since the original search had been scaled back nearly a year earlier. This time, the approach was different from the beginning. There would be no large-scale deployment, no overlapping teams, no reliance on broad coverage. Instead, the operation was structured around precision, with a small group of trained personnel assigned to examine every section methodically, without assumption and without time pressure. The team selected for the operation included experienced search specialists, forensic technicians, and park rangers familiar with the terrain. Each member was briefed with the same directive. Nothing would be overlooked, and nothing would be interpreted prematurely. The objective was not to confirm an existing theory, but to identify what had been missed. The search began within the boundaries that had previously been off-limits. From the outset, the difference between this operation and the one conducted in July 2021 was clear in its structure. The area was not treated as a peripheral zone but as a primary point of interest. Every segment was documented in detail. Any indication of human presence, no matter how minor, was recorded, catalogued, and evaluated in context. Within the first day, the team identified signs that immediately shifted the tone of the investigation. These were not dramatic findings. There were no obvious markers that could be linked directly to Emily Carter or her son. Instead, there were subtle indicators, patterns that suggested sustained human activity over time. Not recent, but not entirely abandoned either. The kind of presence that would not have been detected in a rapid, large-scale search, but became visible under focused examination. The findings were relayed back to command. Investigators reviewing the reports began to recognize a possibility that had not been seriously considered before. If someone had been living within that area, outside of official monitoring, beyond the standard routes, and within a zone that had been temporarily restricted, then it was possible that Emily and Noah had not been alone after the moment they disappeared. The search continued with increased attention to those indicators. Further into the operation, the team located a structure. It was not part of any official park record. It did not appear on any map used during the original search. Its existence had not been documented in maintenance logs, ranger reports, or environmental surveys. The structure had been there long enough to show signs of consistent use, yet it had remained entirely outside the scope of prior investigation. The discovery triggered immediate escalation. Law enforcement was notified, and the site was secured under investigative protocol. The assumption at that moment was cautious. The structure could represent an unrelated presence, someone living off-grid, someone passing through, or something entirely separate from the Carter case. But given its location within the previously restricted zone, it could not be dismissed. The interior was examined under controlled conditions. What investigators found did not match the expectations of abandonment or neglect. The space contained evidence of ongoing habitation. Items were organized, maintained, and functional. There were no indications of panic or disorder. Instead, the environment reflected stability, something that had been sustained over an extended period without interruption. That detail became critical. If someone had been living there consistently since before or during July 2021, then they would have been present at the exact time Emily Carter disappeared. The possibility that this individual had encountered her was no longer theoretical. It became a central line of inquiry. Additional analysis focused on identifying the occupant. Records were reviewed for individuals known to frequent remote areas of the park. Rangers were consulted regarding any previous sightings or reports that might align with the existence of such a structure. The results were limited, but one name began to surface in fragmented references: Daniel Brooks. He was not listed as a permanent resident, nor was he associated with any official program or employment within the park. However, there were occasional mentions of a man matching his description. Someone known to operate independently, familiar with the terrain, and capable of sustaining himself without relying on standard infrastructure. The connection was not immediate, but it was enough to warrant further investigation. Efforts were made to locate Daniel Brooks. At the same time, forensic teams continued processing the site. Samples were collected from various surfaces. Materials were catalogued for later analysis. The objective was to determine whether any of the items present could be linked to Emily Carter or her son, even indirectly. As the process continued, the absence of certain elements became just as important as the presence of others. There were no signs of forced entry, no indications that the structure had been used to conceal or detain anyone, no evidence of conflict or distress. The environment suggested continuity rather than disruption. That distinction began to influence the interpretation of the site. Investigators started to consider a different possibility. If Emily Carter had reached this location, it might not have been under threat. It might have been the result of circumstance, disorientation, injury, or an inability to return to the main trail. And if Daniel Brooks had encountered her under those conditions, his role in the situation might not align with suspicion, but with something else entirely. That possibility remained unconfirmed. The search for Daniel Brooks intensified as the operation continued. His absence from the site did not align with the signs of recent habitation. If he had been present regularly, then his sudden disappearance at the moment the area was re-entered raised additional questions. The investigation stood at a critical point. For the first time since July 2021, there was a location, a potential witness, and a scenario that could explain how Emily and Noah had remained undetected. But the absence of direct confirmation meant that the case remained unresolved. What had changed was the framework. The narrative was no longer centered on loss within an inaccessible environment. It had shifted toward the possibility of survival within a place that had been overlooked, not because it was hidden beyond reach, but because it had been excluded at the exact moment it mattered most. The search for Daniel Brooks did not take long once the focus shifted fully toward identifying him. Unlike the absence that had defined the early months of the investigation, this stage produced something tangible. Records that had once seemed irrelevant were reviewed again, this time with a specific name in mind. Fragmented reports from park rangers, occasional mentions in incident logs, and informal references from individuals familiar with remote areas of the park began to align. Daniel Brooks was not entirely invisible. He had simply existed outside the systems that normally tracked people. He had no permanent address registered within the county, no employment record tied to any organization operating in or around the park. His name did not appear in any official residency database. Yet he had been noticed, quietly, inconsistently, by those who spent time in less accessible parts of the area. A man living alone, self-sufficient, rarely interacting, but not behaving in a way that triggered concern. That pattern made him difficult to classify. Law enforcement treated the situation with caution. There was no indication that Daniel had committed a crime. There was also no evidence that he had attempted to conceal his presence. The structure discovered during the search had not been hidden in a deliberate sense. It had simply existed beyond the boundaries of routine patrols and outside the scope of the original search operation. The question was no longer whether Daniel Brooks existed. The question was where he was now. Efforts to locate him expanded quickly. Rangers were briefed with updated information. Local authorities coordinated with nearby communities, checking for any recent sightings or interactions. Given his history of living independently, it was likely that he remained within the same general region, but the lack of fixed movement patterns made tracking him difficult. 3 days after the structure was secured, the situation changed. Daniel Brooks was found. He was located within the same restricted zone, not far from the structure that had drawn attention to the area. The encounter was controlled, without resistance or escalation. He did not attempt to leave or avoid contact. Instead, he remained present, as if unaware that his existence had become central to an active investigation. He was brought in for questioning under standard procedure. From the beginning, his statements did not align with the assumptions that had built up around the case over the past year. There was no indication of evasion, no attempt to construct an alternative version of events, and no behavior suggesting awareness of wrongdoing. Instead, what he provided was a sequence of information that shifted the direction of the investigation completely. According to Daniel Brooks, he had encountered Emily Carter on July 12, 2021. The timeline he described matched the early hours of the disappearance. He had been moving through the area as part of his routine when he became aware of a situation that required attention. His familiarity with the terrain allowed him to reach locations that would have been difficult for an unfamiliar visitor to navigate, especially under unexpected conditions. He stated that Emily had not been in a position to return to the main trail. Her condition at the time had prevented independent movement. There was no suggestion of external threat, no indication of conflict. What he described aligned with a scenario involving disorientation and injury, something that could occur without warning, even within a relatively accessible area. The presence of the infant had altered his response. Daniel did not contact authorities. The reason he provided was consistent with his background. He had lived outside formal systems for years, relying on his own resources and avoiding institutional involvement. His decision-making reflected that mindset. Rather than seeking assistance, he had taken responsibility for the situation himself. He had brought Emily and her son to his structure. From that point forward, his account remained consistent. He had provided what he could: shelter, food, and basic care. He had not attempted to leave the area or report the encounter. The isolation that defined his lifestyle had extended to the situation itself, effectively removing Emily and Noah from any path that would have led back to the search efforts taking place less than a few miles away. The implications of his statement were immediate. If his account was accurate, then Emily Carter and her son had never been lost beyond reach. They had been within a contained area the entire time, sustained by a single individual operating outside the systems that had been searching for them. Verification became the next priority. Investigators cross-referenced his timeline with known data points. The location of the structure, the restricted zone, and the absence of search coverage all aligned with his description. The lack of physical evidence in the surrounding areas now had a different explanation. Emily had not continued moving through the park. She had stopped, and from that moment forward, her path had remained fixed. The question that followed was unavoidable. Were they still alive? Daniel Brooks provided a direct answer. Yes. The confirmation shifted the entire case. What had been treated as a probable fatal disappearance for nearly a year was now an active recovery operation. The focus moved immediately from investigation to retrieval. Medical teams were placed on standby. Coordination with park authorities intensified. The objective was no longer to understand what had happened, but to bring Emily Carter and her son out of the place where they had remained unseen for 11 months. The case, once defined by absence, had become defined by presence. For Linda Carter, the update arrived without warning. The information was delivered in controlled terms, but its impact was immediate and undeniable. The assumption she had resisted for nearly a year, that her daughter and grandson were gone, was no longer supported by the facts. They had been there the entire time. And now, for the first time since July 12, 2021, there was a confirmed path leading back to them. The recovery operation began immediately after confirmation, but it unfolded with a level of care that reflected both urgency and restraint. There was no room for error, not after 11 months defined by absence and uncertainty. Every step had to be controlled, deliberate, and grounded in the understanding that the outcome, now within reach, could still be compromised by haste. Emily Carter and her son Noah were located exactly where Daniel Brooks had described. Their condition aligned with the timeline that had been reconstructed through his account. Emily was severely weakened, the result of prolonged isolation and limited resources, but she was alive. Noah, now over a year old, showed signs of adaptation to the environment he had never chosen but had survived within. The reality of their existence in that place did not match any expectation that had been formed during the months of investigation. It did not resemble loss. It resembled endurance. Medical teams moved in under strict protocol. Stabilization came first. Transport followed. There was no public announcement at that stage. Information was contained, verified, and processed through official channels before any external communication was made. The priority was not the story. It was the people at the center of it. Emily was transferred to a regional medical facility, where a team of specialists began assessing her condition. The focus extended beyond immediate physical health. Prolonged isolation carries consequences that cannot be measured through standard metrics alone. Nutrition, infection risk, and exhaustion were only part of the equation. The psychological impact of nearly a year removed from society, without contact, without certainty, required a different kind of attention. Noah was placed under pediatric care. Despite the circumstances, his condition offered something unexpected, a form of resilience that did not erase what had happened but reframed it. He had survived a situation that, by all statistical models, should not have been survivable. His development reflected adaptation rather than damage. That detail, small as it seemed in the context of the case, became one of the few elements that did not require explanation. It simply existed. Linda Carter was brought in shortly after the recovery. The timeline that had once ended in a parking lot was now continuing in a hospital room. The distance between those 2 points, measured in months, in unanswered questions, in quiet refusals to accept finality, collapsed into a single moment. What she had insisted on, what she had held on to without evidence, now stood in front of her as fact. The reunion did not erase the past year. It did not resolve the decisions that had led to the delay, nor did it answer every question that remained about how the situation had unfolded. But it changed the nature of the case. It shifted it from something that required explanation to something that demanded reflection. The investigation continued, but its focus changed. Internal reviews were conducted regarding the original restriction of the search area. The decision-making process was examined in detail, not for the purpose of assigning immediate blame, but to understand how a critical section of the terrain had remained unsearched during the most important window of time. The findings were complex. Procedures had been followed. Protocols had been cited. Yet the outcome revealed a gap, one that had consequences that extended beyond the boundaries of policy. Daniel Brooks' role was evaluated with equal care. His decision not to contact authorities was not ignored, but it was considered within the context of his circumstances. He had not acted with intent to harm. He had not concealed Emily or her son in a way that suggested control or coercion. Instead, he had responded according to a system of understanding that existed outside conventional expectations. His actions had sustained life even as they had prevented recovery. That contradiction defined how his involvement was understood. No charges were immediately filed. Instead, the case moved into a legal and ethical review, one that acknowledged both the consequences of his choices and the outcome those choices had produced. It was not a situation that fit easily within established categories. It required interpretation rather than immediate judgment. In the months that followed, Emily's recovery progressed steadily. Her return to normal life did not follow a linear path. There were adjustments that could not be rushed, experiences that could not be fully explained to those who had not lived them. The time she had spent in isolation remained part of her, not as a defining trauma, but as a reality she had endured and moved beyond. Noah grew within that transition. He did not carry memory in the way an adult would. His connection to what had happened existed through others, through the people who had found him, cared for him, and brought him back. His future was not shaped by the place he had survived, but by the life that awaited him outside of it. Daniel Brooks did not disappear after the recovery. His presence remained, though it changed in meaning. What had once been isolation became connection, not through sudden transformation, but through gradual integration into a reality he had long existed outside of. The relationship that developed between him and Emily did not begin as something defined. It emerged over time, shaped by shared experience, by understanding that did not require explanation, and by a sense of responsibility that extended beyond obligation. Years later, that connection settled into something stable. Not dramatic, not defined by a single moment, but built through consistency. What had once been an encounter defined by circumstance became a relationship grounded in choice. A family, formed not through expectation, but through the quiet accumulation of trust. The case of Emily Carter and her son did not end with a discovery in the forest. It ended with a recognition that absence does not always mean loss, that systems, no matter how structured, can overlook what does not fit within their boundaries, that survival is not always visible, and that sometimes the difference between being lost and being found is not distance but direction. And most of all, it left behind a question that remained long after the reports were closed. How many answers are not missing, but simply waiting in the places no one thought to look? Thank you so much for taking the time to listen to today's story all the way to the end. In a world where everything moves so fast, your time, your attention, and your willingness to stay with a story like this truly mean more than you might realize. This story is not just about a disappearance or even about survival. It is about something deeper, about how easily things can be overlooked, how quickly people can be forgotten, and how sometimes the truth is not far away, but simply hidden in the places we fail to see. It reminds us that life is fragile, but also incredibly resilient. That even in the most uncertain situations, hope can still exist quietly, waiting to be found. Maybe the most important lesson we can take from this story is this: never stop looking, never stop questioning, and never assume that what you see is the whole truth. Sometimes, the difference between loss and survival is not distance, but perspective. And sometimes, what truly matters is having someone who refuses to give up on you, no matter how much time has passed. If this story made you feel something, or gave you something to think about, you can support our channel in a very simple way. Just leave a like, share your thoughts in the comments below, and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps us continue bringing more meaningful stories like this to you. Thank you again for being here, and we hope to see you in the next story.